Hi, I'm Matthew Collings. Welcome to the last programme in this series about Renaissance painting. We've forgotten how to value the Renaissance. We're so familiar with its effects, so used to that magnificent, grand coherence that it has, that we almost don't think about it. I'm going to take that impression apart and put it back together again to see what makes it tick. See how the micro relates to the macro. We think of these sites as belonging to the heritage industry. It's the art that came before modern art. But when it was done, it was modern art. It was artists trying out new things at a time when society was rocked by new ideas about meaning and reality. In each programme, I look at one great work. Between them, they sum up the range of mood that Renaissance art offers. So far, it's been Disturbing Symbols in the Garden of Earthly Delights by Hieronymus Bosch, and Radiant Light in the Madonna of the Meadow by Raphael. In this programme, it is the space that Piero della Francesca creates in his Baptism of Christ that I'm going to be concentrating on. Piero was the pioneer whose ideas made possible the art of Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael. Piero painted figures and objects composed in a space that goes back very far to distant hills. At the same time, these are shapes composed across the surface of a flat piece of wood. I'm going to be explaining exactly how it is that space in a painting can create drama and emotion. I'm going to be saying where it's happening and how it works. Baptism is usually a purification ritual where you're received into the church. But when it's Christ being baptized, that's something different. Historically, the church and Christianity didn't exist yet. They would both come later. When Jesus is baptized, it's to become a purer kind of Jew. The baptism of Jesus is probably a historical event. As with Jesus, John the Baptist is very likely a real figure. And the purification ritual he performed on people, involving immersion in water, is about rebirth, washing away the sins of the past, starting a new life in anticipation that this world will very soon, any day in fact, come to an end. And there will be a last judgment, a final reckoning. That is the historical version of what you're looking at. The mythological, biblical version is what Piero is interested in. His own original interpretation of the gospel story. Coming out of the wilderness, Christ asks John to baptize him in the River Jordan. Also standing in the river as it meanders back into the picture is someone else waiting to be baptized, taking his shirt off. Maybe it's Jesus in a moment before as a flashback, or a flash forward as he puts his shirt back on. It's not something you can look up in a book. It's Piero thickening the richness of his scene with a suggestive detail. The story of the baptism, which happens in a few lines in the Gospels, is the first time in the Bible that the concept of the Trinity is mentioned, the three-part nature of God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Here's the traditional visual sign for the Holy Spirit, a dove. And here is a peculiarly Renaissance representation of Christ, a sort of physically perfect man, like a Greek god, like a statue. But we're missing the whole set. Where's God?
There used to be an image of him above the painting, on an elaborate frame now lost. The faint remains of thin gold lines show light rendered in the medieval way, like stylized rays, coming down from God through the Holy Spirit. So the way space is organised in this painting told its original audience something new and fresh about the Holy Trinity. For modern people who live in a mostly secular society, the beauty of the space is felt just as keenly, but we're unsure what it tells us. Renaissance people felt its connection to the idea of Christ as the centre of existence. With us, it's a feeling that our world lacks something, and maybe art provides it. And maybe the pleasure of art is at the root of it.
Pleasure isn't just niceness or a break from the heavy. The heavy actually is in the pleasure of art. Pleasure is the place where profundity is. And the pleasure of this is in the delicacy of the space that Piero is painting. It comes from a combination of elements. The sort of wispiness of the clouds, the tiny amount of water pouring on the head, the delicate, elegant distance between the head and the bowl, the glow around the head, the wispy cloth across this body, the pretty, light angel's wings, the careful segmentation of the leaves in the tree above, so that those leaves seem incredibly unreal.
All those delicate touches that animate the space of the painting also bring the story to life.
There are angels present, and there are great figures who might be prophets or kings present. And there is a feeling of radiant, fresh brightness, as if every object in the natural world is suddenly heightened, as if the whole world is surprised, because by this action, Christ becomes Christ, the Redeemer, the Saviour, this momentous event. And that's why the scene is important.
Already the layered nature of the beauty of the space is coming through. Ordinary life experience in the time of the Renaissance is another layer. In the background of Piero's Renaissance landscape, he pictures Jerusalem, using as a model the place where he lived, a little town in central Italy called San Sepolcro. Between the blobs and the reality is the time nearly 600 years ago when Piero was born, in about 1412. Although he travelled a lot to paint commissions, he always returned to this base. The look of the place, as it was in his time, a small medieval walled town, is as important in the baptism of Christ as the surrounding countryside, which has hardly changed today. The same walnut trees glinting in the light on the hills today. Piero puts one in next to Christ. Space, life, nature. And politics, yet another layer. It's likely that the baptism was painted for Camaldolite monks, whose abbey was in San Sepolcro. The big political issue for them was the split in the Christian church between the East and the West.
The particular order of monks that the picture was painted for, or that it was very likely done for, has close ties with the Eastern Christian Church, which is based in Constantinople. The head of the order, and it's a very widespread order, very powerful order, the head, who's a humanist scholar and a philosopher and a kind of religious politician, he advocates union between the Eastern and Western churches. Largely for military reasons. It's so that Western troops might go out and help defend Constantinople against invasion by Muslim Turks. The monks explain these issues to Piero and discuss them with him, and he has to come up with a way to fuse political meaning with religious symbols.
The great men witnessing the event wear Eastern Church clothing. The angels, who would be holding Christ's clothes in a traditional depiction of the baptism of Christ, are actually holding hands, the traditional sign of unity. The troops were never sent, and Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, a few years after the baptism was painted. Piero often used the bold shapes of Eastern Church clothing to create points of visual intensity in his paintings. His audience would have been alert to this look. There was a great fear that the whole of the West would be next in the Islamic takeover. All these different types of meaning are given a particular form by Piero, both very flat and very spatial, both very meditative and very real. He grew up with this purely medieval altarpiece by Nicola di Segno. The focus is Christ rising from the dead.
It's a very rich and powerful work in a basically Middle Ages tradition. A complicated object with a lot of exciting spiky shapes, painted gold, which would have related to the architectural shapes of whatever church it was in when it was originally made. And a rich cast of painted characters whose every position of face, gesture, body is carefully calculated to activate those shapes. Every picture and object in the churches that Piero knew as a teenager would have given him his visual language. But something like this would have seemed the most ambitious and highest that visual art could go. It would have summed up the teenage Piero's visual horizons.
The symbolic world in medieval art, where everything's gold, becomes the real world in Renaissance art. Piero's own hills, trees, his town. These were the everyday settings for scenes of miraculous events. He painted religious pictures for the town's various institutions. Churches, monasteries, civic buildings. Only a handful of the paintings survive. There were scenes that didn't just happen in the Bible long ago. The idea was that they happened forever, in eternity. They happened all the time to everyone, everywhere. They're happening now. When Piero painted the risen Christ, which he knew so well from medieval art, he made it monumental and physical. Christ like a warrior stepping out into space. Sleeping humanity below. death represented by a winter landscape on the left, and Christ bringing life represented by a spring landscape on the right. It is thought that the sleeping soldier here is Piero's own self-portrait. Whether he was particularly pious or not, we have no idea. He's a Renaissance character, and the Renaissance was the time when religious meaning in art started to change and adapt. So revering the cosmic dimension of existence was joined by understanding the physical laws of the universe. In art, the cosmic was joined by the scientific. To see what the purely cosmic used to be like, go back through time, from Piero to medieval art, to very early Christian art.
Here is Piero's exact subject, the baptism of Christ, done 1,000 years before Piero. Where Piero's picture shows us the effect of the heavenly dimension on the earthly world, here there is no earthly world, only the purity of the realm beyond us.
Done for Gothic kings in the 5th century AD, a mosaic in a tower in the city of Ravenna. It expresses ultimate meaning through pure pattern.
We've got a very big picture which is in the form of a circle, and that circularity is repeated again and again, so that every single patterned element in the picture reminds you that it is conforming to a circle. Chasing patterns, circles, symmetry and repetition, and then clever little variations on repetition. So you've got 12 apostles, and each apostle is wearing white. But each of their outfits is a sort of triumph of very, very complicated, playful abstraction. And in that playfulness, there's all sorts of different whites. And the more you look within those togas, the more surprising it becomes how little actual white there is in there. And in fact, you're looking at rather lovely sort of muddy tones of green and brown. But then when you look in the inner circle, where the beings who are much higher in the religious hierarchy are existing, you see they're much brighter. So the tones in that circular pattern are telling you something about religion. They're telling you something about spirituality. So the mosaic artists are making abstract ideas connect to religious symbolism.
Artists' methods and techniques in any period of history are pretty abstract, but they are adapted to suit whatever the prevailing big idea of reality is. With Piero, subtle tonal adjustments are just as important as with centuries-old mosaic art, but they have a different meaning. In the Renaissance period, man's power of thinking and reasoning was the big focus. In this climate, art came to be seen as a new form of knowledge. Artists used to be artist craftsmen. Now they were artist philosophers. Art was expected to be multi-layered. But however many ideas are going on in the baptism, at a basic level, it's a painting done on a flat bit of wood. And that's the level I'm going to look at now. The first thing to say is that the medium Piero used for the baptism was tempera.
Tempera is basically pigment bound in a certain medium. And this is what pigment is. Pigment starts out as sort of raw rocks of colour. That's a bit of malachite, a lovely green colour, and that's a raw rock of lapis lazuli, a lovely blue colour. Of course, there are lots of other types of colours. Those rocks will be refined, washed, processed in certain ways to produce certain tones. They'll be darker where the pigment is purer and lighter where the pigment is less pure. And that'll produce a kind of powder. Now that powder will then be ground and mixed with the binder. And the binder, when you're talking about tempera, is these guys, eggs.
The powder is ground, and then egg is poured in, and the powder ground into the egg. Gradually the lumps disappear, and pigment and egg are fused. The egg acts as a kind of liquid glue. It's very strong when it dries, which it does very fast. The paint is fixed and remains fixed for centuries. The nature of the binder affects how you actually put the paint on, how you create an image.
So when you've got a painting that's done with tempera, and you've got a graded form, you know, like a bit of sky that's going from a light blue to a slightly darker blue, that graded form is going to be done in a different way than if you were doing it in oil paint. With oil paint, you just sort of merge and squish the colours into each other, squish light into dark. With tempera, you have to do those tones in graded stops from light to dark. So I'm going to show you something like that now. Here's a bit of blue. So we're going to do strokes side by side. One slightly darker for the next one, but not so dark that it jumps out too much. When Piero did that, he would be doing it with very, very small strokes, like little tiny dots or stretched out dots, one next to the other. And he wouldn't let one overlap with another, because with tempera, there's the danger that one stroke overlapping with another will slightly wash away the other stroke. But that's pretty much what a graded form in a tempera painting looks like when you go in close.
Any artist painting realistically basically creates an illusion of real things in real space by this grading. It creates an illusion that light is falling on an object. So a part is brighter where the light is, and darker where the light isn't. So tonal grading is any Renaissance artist's basic language. Tempera is very limited in the way you can elaborate these effects, because it dries so quickly. But even so, Piero does a lot with it. He puts transparent colour over a dried surface so that angel's wing seems see-through. He does spontaneous, fast, blipping strokes to create the leaves, so the freshness of the mark creates a sort of visual metaphor for a feeling of the freshness of something in nature out in the open. At a very basic level, he builds up the flesh tones and the clothing colours on a ground of earthy, basic green, so there's always a feeling of depth to the colour. Piero gets paint to suggest those realities, and yet he never lets you forget that it is a painting. It is a made thing. Everything in it has a carefully calculated place. And these effects of reality, metaphors for the glimpsing, slipping sensations of what it's really like to be seeing something in reality, are all just little tweaks of a whole composition that is solidly ordered and arranged and actually very far from reality.
A man's body is made to seem like a tree. They're both ivory white, both tonally graded, both like columns, the same shape, the same colour, both lined up in the same way. A poetic meaning from the Psalms: happy is the man who turns away from wickedness, he is like a tree planted by flowing water, is made into a visual meaning. So the poetic comparison, man, tree, seems to come miraculously to life.
When the base level, painting something so it looks real, is working, then the higher levels, questioning what reality actually is, can work. Piero's mind changed from basically medieval to full-on Renaissance after he lived for a long period in the place where the Renaissance began. Sometime in the late 1430s, when he was in his late 20s, he would leave the satellite town of San Sepolcro and travel to the capital of the region, the city of Florence. Painted frescoes for a church, all of them now lost, and absorbed the newly minted look of Renaissance culture all around him. Bold, spare, geometric shapes were the basis of the new dome for Florence Cathedral, recently designed by the Renaissance architect Brunelleschi. They express clarity of mind. They come from classical Roman architecture. This is the look of classicism. Its basic unit is the circle and the square. In a new Renaissance arcade, also designed by Brunelleschi, pure, clean, streamlined arches frankly reveal their geometric basis. Those arches are made of a circle at the top, overlapping a square below. No longer the pointy Gothic arches of medieval times, based on the shapes of mountains and leaves, nature in Renaissance architecture is almost forgotten. It's a much more conceptual look. Not God creating everything, but us down below, contemplating everything. Wondering about our own control over everything. There was a whole new sense of nature, immediate, tangible reality conjured up and contained within abstract ideas about space. Classical big shapes and classical simplification. You can see the formula in Piero's baptism, which he painted about 10 years after his Florence experience.
It's a picture that's divided into parts. There's this part with the angels, and then there's this part with everything else. And what unites them is the repetition of an arch shape. This is the arch for the angels, the white branch up there, and this is the arch for everything else, the bough of that tree. And they both repeat the shape of the arch that is the top of the painting. And once you start to get that arch theme, you see how Piero goes on repeating it in little ways. There's the arch of the hand over Christ's head. There's the arch made by Christ's fingers as he prays. And there's the arch of that bent body of the man waiting to be baptized. There's even the arch made by John the Baptist's legs. All those arches repeat the arch of the top of the painting. And heaven is in that arch.
All the ancient design ideas wow Renaissance people. Florentine artists travelled to Rome and saw fragments of art there that were over 1,000 years old. Buildings that had Roman design of amazing, massive geometric power. And marble reliefs showing people in depth, smaller in the distance, larger nearer to the eye. What laws did they have to work that out? The Renaissance artists wondered. Renaissance artists thought that classical artists were geniuses to have invented this trick. So to show their respect, they reinvented it and gave it a name. They called it perspective. In about 1425, Brunelleschi arrived at a method of organising spatial illusions in a picture according to geometric laws. This is a drawing by Brunelleschi from a few years later. He's using perspective to show the interior of a church he designed in Florence called the San Spirito. Perspective means a 3D space plotted out on a 2D surface, a piece of paper, with diagonal lines, invisible in the final image, but used to work out the space. The lines lead far back into a distant vanishing point, like invisible artificial railway lines. As soon as Brunelleschi codified this new discovery, the painter Masaccio monumentalized it with a painting in the church of Santa Maria Novella, a painting you can get best if you approach it from a tangent, first taking in the whole environment. All around the edges of the big central space are privately owned individual chapels set into alcoves. They all have arched entrances and, in the back, because the owners of the chapels are wealthy, the latest modern art. Like this Renaissance crucifixion by Brunelleschi. So the chapel spaces in the church are art spaces as well as praying spaces. The first one people saw when they entered the church, having passed through the graveyard outside with its spirits of the dead, was this one. Only it isn't a space, but an illusion of one, an image of Christ's triumph over death in a carefully plotted optical zooming trick, the trick of perspective, where the crucifixion appears to be happening inside that arched recessed space. Different squares of coloured marble are receding back into deep space. Only they're not really doing that. It's geometrically distorted shapes painted to make it appear as if there's a deep space. It's a powerful illusion to support a powerful scene. There are 3 different focuses piled on top of each other. God, and then Christ, and then in the group below, lamenting saints and portraits of the people who paid for this painting to be done, the donors. And then, finally, there's you the viewer, receiving the full, solemn blast of all this fantastic illusionism. In Masaccio's Madonna and Child, the little lutes point into and out of a perspective illusion of deep space. The Madonna's throne is shaped like classical architecture, with miniature classical pillars. And the Madonna and Child each turn slightly differently, as if by twisting their bodies in space, they're not only being utterly holy, but they're also being artistically playful, teasing your mind by filling it with illusions of space. The first audiences confronted by perspective in paintings found it jarring. It was distracting when you were supposed to be quietly contemplating your soul. But 25 years later, it had set in and was the norm for art. Perspective is a visual trick. The philosophical implication of the trick for a Renaissance mind, as opposed to a medieval one, is a more human-centred vision of reality, less God-centred. Perspective suggests rational, our cleverness, in a tension with God's inscrutable profundity. When the Renaissance brings realistic depth into art, it's not just that another dimension is added. 2D goes into 3D. It's that the extra dimension comes from a human way of seeing. It's our thought joining God's mystical meanings and eventually replacing them. That's the big leap you're seeing when you see Piero's head with Jesus above stepping out into space. A vast opening out of possibilities of what art can do. Piero got his feeling for little touches of believable liveliness from the art of the Northern Renaissance. It was known down in Florence because of banking and trade connections with the North. This painting by the Northern artist Jan van Eyck is actually a portrait of a Florentine banker and his wife, the Arnolfinis, who were based in the city of Bruges in the Netherlands. Piero was interested in the bursting, real immediacy that this kind of art had. Northern art hadn't yet learned perspective. If the Arnolfinis were to take a couple of steps back, their heads would knock that chandelier. They're giants compared to the way the space of the room has been plotted. Piero worked in a lot of different mediums. Tempera and fresco, learned from the medieval tradition. Oil paint, learned from northern artists who invented the method. But he always did the same kind of thing. Big, simple shapes, little touches of unpredictable spontaneity to complicate and enrich the calm bigness.
So a picture like this, Piero's altarpiece of St. Anthony, which he probably painted within 10 years of painting the baptism of Christ. A picture in which he scrambles styles, mixing the new modern look of perspective, an extreme sense of rushing space, which you're compelled to acknowledge and get into and believe in, mixing that new look with the old, mysterious, medieval, compartmentalized flatness is really what Piero always does. He's maybe a bit more extreme with his style mixing here than he is with the baptism of Christ. He's deliberately letting the seams show, making a sort of visual statement out of style difference, but juggling those differences to create an emotional effect, a sort of beautiful, dignified, emotional restraint or simmering is really what Piero always does. He never lets you forget that it is a painting, and he does that in a way that is unique to him in his time, but it leads to the visual tradition that we call the High Renaissance.
The spatial understanding of Leonardo da Vinci came from Leonardo studying Piero's paintings, and from studying his writings and diagrams showing how to create space in a painting. Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, Michelangelo. The artists you've heard of, and you know what they do. You wouldn't have heard of them if Piero had not pioneered the style that they later evolved. When Leonardo develops Piero's ideas, space is beautifully hazy and suggestive. When Piero spells space out, you can sometimes see why the early audiences of Renaissance art were alarmed. He painted halos as if he could hold one and give it a spin, with their shiny gold undersurfaces reflecting the heads of his holy saints. Piero was peculiar also in working with a very pared-back setup, even after he became very famous. He had few assistants. He stopped and started on different overlapping commissions, working mostly on his own. He stopped and started for so long on this, his earliest surviving commission, it took 17 years to finish. The wealthy, devout donors are pictured kneeling in a circle around the giant Virgin, whose halo is a matching circle.
That halo is a 3D illusion. It's an ellipse shape that describes a solid flat circle or disc that recedes into space. And you can imagine that circle elaborated down through the cloak to the people protected within it. Each one of their bodies is placed so that another big circle is described down below. But all of that depth, those rounded bodies, all of that space has to happen on a sheer, flat plane, the beautiful gold ground upon which everything is painted.
It's obvious the work is made up of different parts in a geometric arrangement. But it's not obvious, while being totally crucial to the beauty of the whole thing, that each individual part is itself geometrically arranged. Picture of spiritual meaning is calculated into place by a mathematical mind. Piero was taught maths as a child, but kept up the learning into adult life. He was as famous in his own time for maths as he was for painting. Inside that building in San Sepolcro are the remains of the house in which Piero spent the last part of his life. It was in here that he wrote the earliest known work in history on the mathematics of perspective. He illustrated his books with diagrams and written out mental exercises. Every one had a root in real paintings he created, most of them lost now. And every object and space in the surviving paintings that we can see today has some kind of relationship to some mathematical working out that he did.
I'm going to take a few steps across the floor, a distance of about 6 feet, towards a hideous glass box with a horrible frame containing a painting which is one of the most beautiful, intriguing, and ultimately inexplicable works of art of the entire Renaissance.
The mysterious, the rational. He so carefully rationalized space in this painting that modern mathematicians have calculated the distance between the flat picture plane in front and the vanishing point at the back. 250 feet. The number isn't significant, but the precision is. This classical piazza could actually be built by an architect using this painting as a blueprint. It is called the Flagellation. It shows Christ being whipped on the night before his crucifixion. People around Jesus here, and 3 men indifferent to his suffering here. Why are they divided? Piero teases you into thinking it's 2 different worlds, while showing you clearly with his perspective shapes that they all stand on the same floor. Although there are many theories, no one today knows who those three people are. Probably only Piero and the unknown client he painted the picture for ever knew that. But this picture demonstrates how perspective enabled Piero to create a wholly new type of visual drama in art. The emotional personality of the painting is all in the way the scene is divided up, while the people themselves remain almost above emotion or distanced from emotion. He sets up an architectural space and then obscures key architectural transitions. Bodies are deliberately placed in the way, but they also enhance your experience of the whole space. Pontius Pilate sits in the corner, making an L shape. The same shape is shown inverted in the diametrically opposite corner as empty space. The turn of everyone's head leads your eye around the space. How the space is revealed becomes meaningful. You start to notice how the light above Christ purposefully doesn't fit the way the light falls everywhere else. The effect is that space becomes loaded. The mystical meaning of a religious scene becomes loaded. You can dig out the space behind the baptism by focusing on the frame. It's a 19th century object, stuck on when the painting was bought by London's National Gallery from an auction in Italy. The original frame is in San Sepolcro.
The message of this frame is axiality. Christ is the still central vertical line, the axis around which many other visual events revolve.
It's a surprisingly complicated object, out of scale with the baptism, which is almost ambushed by saints painted by another artist later on. But it does show how Piero visualises various concepts of Christ through maths. The baptism is the first event in a series of events over a period of a few months that will lead to the ultimate one, Christ's death on the cross. Here is the cross. Heaven is a circle, and the earth is a square. Christ is the force that unites heaven and earth. The circle overlaps the square. Earth's appearance is only a reflection of heaven's perfection. The perfect circle is imitated by the curve of the valley between the hills. Christ arrives and the Holy Spirit extends across the whole earth. The dove's wings border the edge of the square. Through his manipulation of space, Piero makes a simple, joyful, light-filled scene into a whole edifice of ideas. Our place in the natural world, the fleeting pleasures of existence, our place in the larger notion of existence, in infinity. Your mind moves around the ideas with complete, relaxed enjoyment because of the intensely structured way in which they're conveyed.
I'm stalking these effects now, kind of dissecting them, analysing them. But when you're looking at the picture, analysis isn't exactly what's going on. You're seeing and you're getting pleasure from seeing. And partly the picture is telling you how pleasure is constructed, how it's created, and partly you're just lost in it. So when you're lost in the light of Piero, you're experiencing when you've forgotten how to experience. And you're suddenly curious when you've forgotten how to be curious. And what you're experiencing and being curious about is the world.
The message that we are only an imperfect reflection of what heaven is comes across in the picture by Piero building its visual pleasure on a theme of what can be seen and what can't.
Christ, the centre of meaning, is entirely clear, but everything else is deliberately not clear. John the Baptist is turned away, so we don't entirely see him. The kings in the background are obscured. The angels are slightly hiding each other, and they're hidden by the tree. And I'm prevented from enjoying the sight of the tops of the hills because they too are obscured. The obscurity theme gets elaborated.
He rationalises every single element, but then throws in a deliberate distortion. The reflections in the water are unreal. The distances wouldn't allow them.
I think this obscurity meaning is about us not understanding everything that is offered to us, because only God knows. Life on earth is a reflection of true reality, which is in heaven, which we only get to in the afterlife. So Piero carefully sets up metaphors for Christian meanings. You're obliged to think about them, even if you don't consciously get them.
In his own time, Piero's status as a great artist was mainly due to multi-scene frescoes that he painted in important buildings. The only one of these great works that has survived is his design for the chapel of the Church of San Francesca in the town of Arezzo, which he worked on for many years, starting in 1452. Piero illustrates the medieval legend of the true cross. Angels place a seed in the mouth of the dying Adam, the first man, that will grow into the tree that the cross will be carved from. The angel Gabriel tells Mary she's going to give birth to Christ. The Roman Emperor Constantine has the dream that will cause Christianity to become the official religion of the Roman Empire. A legend about the absolute continuity of Christ's power from the beginning of time to forever is dramatized in a total space environment. Giant landscape scenes next to giant interior scenes. Scenes opposite scenes across real space. Real space complementing illusory space. People made into shapes. All as calm and still in their visual effect as each other, whether it's the beautiful heads and hairdos of the biblical Queen of Sheba and her servants, or soldiers stabbing each other in the throat in historical battles. All the visual devices we've seen so far in Piero's art play a role here. Illusion and reality. And endlessly inventive shapes. So you feel you can never get enough of looking and re-looking at this epic sight, which survives as the crowning achievement of Piero's life. It was in the same house in San Sepolcro where Piero wrote his books on maths that this enigmatic Renaissance figure, whose life story is mostly a blank and whose personality we can only know from his art, died.
Sleep on, beloved, sleep and take thy rest. Lay down thy head upon thy Saviour's breast. We love thee well, but Jesus loves thee best.
Jesus in Space. Piero contrasts epic timelessness with a feeling of someone you could have just glimpsed in the street this morning. Time is transcended. God rises above it. When Piero shows the seasons changing from winter to spring, he shows the afterlife defeating the sleep of death. Piero was about 80 when he died in 1492. He had been blind for some months, maybe even years. In his art, he had opened people's eyes to a new kind of visual structure, where manipulations of space could tell you about God, politics, society, the kind of giddy ideas mixture that we might expect to find in nowadays contemporary art. But what's amazing about Renaissance art and what we can learn today by looking at it is the way ideas are actually embodied in the shapes and spaces of art. They're not floating some way off, waiting to be explained by someone.
What is a painting? A painting by Piero is always a demonstration of a universal law of art. Nothing in art ever looks good because of some part that isn't actually there. Today we're very uncertain about what it is that art is supposed to do. We don't see that it comes from visual traditions that have built up over centuries, and we don't realise that by junking those traditions in favour of a breathless, urgent sense of the right now, which is what our art mostly does, art gets weaker, like God, politics, society. Art is now a dubious thing for many people. And yet here is something that tells you about power and not weakness, simply because of what has been done there. God, politics, society, feeling a bit solemn and deciding to go and see some Renaissance art. None of these are really the reason why art ever looks good. It's what's actually in the picture that does it.
And that was the final part of Renaissance Revolution. Now there's an autumn special edition of Countryfile here on BBC HD tomorrow night at 6:30. And coming up next tonight, we take a trip to the moon.